Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on something that's, well, the engine behind all human progress. And no, it's not about dusty old textbooks or crazy complicated formulas. It's about a simple but really powerful way of thinking that lets us figure out how the world actually works. We're talking about the scientific process.
So let's just start with a huge question. Think about it. We are swimming in information 24/7. How in the world do you sort through all that noise and figure out what's real? How do you know that something is actually true?
Most of the time, we rely on a few go-to methods. Tradition, it's just how it's always been done. Personal experience, well, this is what happened to me. Or just plain old common sense. And look, those things can be useful, but there's a much better, much more reliable way to get to the truth, and that's science.
Okay, so what is it that makes science so special? The big secret is that science isn't just a giant encyclopedia of facts. Look, it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of thinking that plays by a very clear set of rules. These rules are what separate it from everything else. So here they are, the 6 core principles that give science all its power. We're going to walk through each one piece by piece to see how they all lock together. It all starts with the idea that our knowledge has to be grounded in the real world.
First up, science is empirical. That sounds fancy, but all it really means is that it's based on observation, things we can see or hear or measure. Scientists take these observations and record them as data. And here's the key. If you can't absorb it, it's not really in the realm of science. It's in the realm of belief or faith.
And that observation leads us right to data. There's this big myth out there that science is only about numbers and spreadsheets. But that's just not the whole story. Of course, it uses quantitative data, that's the stuff you can count and measure, but it also relies a ton on qualitative data, things like detailed descriptions of behavior. Both are absolutely vital to get the full picture.
But hey, just piling up a mountain of data isn't the goal. Science is an intellectual pursuit. You've got to use your brain. You've got to use reasoning to analyze all that data and figure out, okay, what is this actually telling me? It's all about connecting the dots to really understand the world.
All right, next up, science has to be systematic. This means every single step of a study is organized, methodical, and, this is huge, made public. Researchers lay out exactly what they did so that anyone, anywhere, can try to repeat it. This is called replication, and it is one of the most important parts of science. It's how we catch mistakes and, just as importantly, how we weed out our own personal biases. And this next one is so crucial. Scientific conclusions are never set in stone. They're provisional. That means they are always open to being questioned, challenged, or even completely overturned if new evidence comes along. So science isn't about finding some final capital T truth. It's a process of constantly getting closer and closer to a more accurate picture of how things work.
And finally, all of this hard work actually matters because science is practical. It's focused on answering real questions that affect our lives, whether that's understanding the genetics of cancer or figuring out the effects of climate change. The end goal is always to take that knowledge and use it to make life better for all of us.
Okay, so we've got the rules of the game. Now let's talk about the process. How do scientists actually use these principles to go out and discover things?
Right. If those 6 rules are the ingredients, what's the recipe? How do you actually do science? Well, it turns out there's a pretty standard playbook that most scientists follow.
And this is it, the scientific method, which usually follows these 6 steps. You see something interesting. That's your observation. That leads you to ask a question. From there, you make an educated guess. That's your hypothesis. And then you set up an experiment to see if you're right. You analyze the results and then, and this part's crucial, you tell everyone what you found. It's a never-ending cycle of curiosity, testing, and sharing.
Now let's talk about that hypothesis for a second. A really good hypothesis, like this one about cars and aerodynamics, has to do 2 things. First, it's got to be testable, right? You can actually go build these car models and measure the air resistance. And second, it has to be falsifiable. That just means there has to be a possible outcome that could prove you wrong. If you can't possibly be proven wrong, it's not a scientific hypothesis. So that's the big picture theory. But what does this actually look like in practice? How does a researcher go from just, a vague curiosity to a real, focused research project?
Well, almost every big discovery starts small, with just a spark of interest in a really broad topic. It can be anything you're curious about. So for example, let's say you're interested in educational psychology.
Okay, educational psychology is huge, right? You can't study all of that at once. So the next step is to narrow it way down. You might decide to focus on something super specific, like technical and vocational education, or TVET, and you might even narrow it down to one country, like Bangladesh. Now you're getting somewhere. You can form a really specific question. Maybe you've noticed that this particular type of education isn't very popular there. So you ask, why is it failing to attract students? Boom. That's a specific gap in our knowledge that you want to fill. And finally, and this is probably the most important part, you have to define the so what. Why should anyone care about the answer to your question? What's the point? In this case, the rationale is that the answer could help us figure out how to improve the quality of education for a lot of people. That's what makes your research valuable.
Now, as scientists are doing all this work, they're basically using two different kinds of logic. Inductive reasoning is when you go from the specific to the general. You see the sun rise every single morning, so you form a general theory the sun will always rise. Deductive reasoning is the opposite. You start with a big general theory, like the laws of economics, to predict a specific thing, like figuring a huge price hike on cigarettes will probably cause some people to quit.
All right, so we've covered the rules, the method, the logic, the whole shebang. But why does any of this matter to those of us who aren't, professional scientists in lab coats?
Because here's the thing. Science isn't a job title. It's not a club you have to join. At its heart, it is simply a mindset. It is an incredibly powerful and reliable toolkit for thinking that anyone can use to better understand the world, to answer their own questions, and to solve problems, big and small.
So, I'm going to leave you with this thought. What are you curious about? Seriously, it could be some little puzzle at your job, a question about one of your hobbies, or even a problem you see in your community. What is one question in your own life that you could start answering today just by thinking a little more like a scientist? Thanks for watching.